Because the very idea of humane animal farming is used as an excuse for people to buy factory farmed products, it's kind of understandable that there is this feeling that welfareism is the enemy to animal rights.
There's a healthy opposition to welfare reforms in much of the movement. We do need criticism of them. We need people in the public conversation who are going to be saying, hey, that's not enough. We need to go further. That's good. But when it comes to our, strategizing the big picture view of the movement, I still think they play an important role. The biggest reason in favor of this, I think, is just the empirical evidence. So like with institutional change and the arguments for that, we see that social movements over time have succeeded more with an institutional approach. We also see, both in past movements and in the contemporary farmed animal movement, that welfare reforms have inspired further change. I think we saw this in the 2015 and 2016 wave of kind of cage-free egg reforms, McDonald's and Walmart and other very large companies getting on board. That led to a lot of conversation around eggs as a bad product and as a generally, product that should be avoided, even if we create those eggs in a different sort of supply chain. I think a lot of us around 2014 and 2015 didn't expect that to be the case. Like I remember some conversations about, well, let's look at the media coverage and see how often people mention, okay, it's easy, it's okay to eat it's okay to eat eggs now, versus, oh, we should actually, not eat eggs in general for these various reasons. And we saw a lot more of the latter and a lot less of the former than we expected. So in practice, I think it tends to work. You saw, again, since I'm using anti-slavery as the example, you saw the abolition of the slave trade precede the abolition of slavery as a practice, as an institution. And that was a very deliberate choice by the movement to first tackle the trade, first tackle the movement of slaves from one place to another. That was more accessible. It was an intermediate goal. They were explicit about that. They knew that that was on the agenda, but then that eventually they would use that momentum, and momentum is going to be a key word here, to actually ban slavery full stop in the British Empire. I think we can also expect those sorts of effects for the farmed animal movement because, for example, a lot of the capacity that we have now as a farmed animal movement was built on the back of those welfare reforms. So for example, donors, nonprofit organizations need a lot of money, whether they're grassroots or whether they're large institutional groups, if they're lobbying the government, if they're trying to build food technology. A lot of these things just take money. And the way to get money in many cases is to tap into this like large philanthropic donor base, which unfortunately very few of them are vegan. And what they get excited about, at least at first, tends to be something like cage-free eggs. So we can get them to, get involved with the organizations. And once you're giving to a group, it becomes much easier to give more to that group and to give to the other projects that that group is working on. So now that, Humane League and Mercy for Animals and animal equality especially, do a lot of work that's more in the abolition, more in the veganism side of things, they can pull in some of those more mainstream resources that we wouldn't have access to if we were just all vegan all the time. Yeah.
Right. Another point you make in the book, which I think is compelling, is the fact that these welfare reforms generally increase the cost of animal products, which therefore means that the consumption goes down as well. So it affects the supply and demand.
That's another one of these virtuous cycles.
I mean, I've talked about welfare reform a little bit on my channel recently, and one of the objections that I get, we've been talking about the anti-slavery movement. People say, well, you wouldn't accept this in a human context. Say if somebody was beating their wife 7 days a week, we wouldn't want them to beat them less hard or beat them once a week. So why would we accept this in an animal context? What would you say to that objection?
Yeah, there's a big difference between individual acceptance. I'm on the street and I see someone beating a dog. What do I do in that? Versus I'm in society as a whole. I'm a social movement. I'm trying to strategize. Things take a much longer time. It's not as simple as I can't go over and grab the factory farmer's arm and say, stop factory farming. And then at least temporarily, in the case of somebody beating a dog on the street, they would stop beating that dog. In the factory farming case, we need to think bigger picture, longer term. And one of the consequences of that is that we do need to consider midway points in the direction of abolition of any cruel institution. And it's just not true that, we wouldn't accept things in the human case at an institutional level, because we have, in virtually every human social movement, there's been some sort of intermediate progress, whether that's abolishing the slave trade, whether that's, Plessy versus Ferguson and these US court cases that established separate but equal, still left room for a lot of cruelty, but got us, one step towards the final outcome of the anti-slavery, anti-racism advocates, which was in many cases, not all of them had the kind of pure end goal in mind of our current values of all races being entirely equal, but certainly pushed further in that direction. So I think it's a step towards change. Even if we wouldn't accept it at an individual level, we need to understand it as an intermediate goal. I should also say that, if you're wanting to donate, wanting to volunteer, by all means, don't focus on welfare reforms. When I'm making these big picture arguments, they're more about, what should the Humane League do? What should these big donors do? What should the people who are fundraising from big donors? How should we have conversations about welfare reforms? Should we be purely critical of it, or should we talk about it as momentum towards our further goals? There are a lot of questions that aren't just, okay, should I myself work on welfare reforms? And there are very few people who I try to convince to focus on welfare reforms. There's some exceptions, maybe if they aren't vegan themselves, aren't really on board with the other stuff, that might be where they can have the most impact. Maybe if they're really good at talking to factory farmers, like talking to the kind of mainstream politicians or corporate executives, then maybe they're just meant to be a corporate campaigner and can be so effective in that particular position. But in most cases, I think people can work in grassroots activism, or even what I'm more excited about often is food technology and trying to build these new products and get them distributed and get them popularized in a way that gets us to our end goal of abolition. So I'm not saying that everyone should go out and focus on welfare reforms, even though I think they form an important part of the overall movement.
Right. And I suppose what seems clear is that we need to have a healthy dialogue about strategy and effectiveness. And we should be able to talk about welfare reforms and talk to people who have the perspective that welfare reform is the way forward, without having kind of an us and them versus them dichotomy, where we're seeing them as the enemy. And this is especially important if the evidence, like you say, suggests that welfare reform is actually helping us get to abolition.